Welcome to the Maintainable Software Podcast, where we explore the art of improving existing software with seasoned practitioners who have helped organizations overcome the problems often associated with technical debt and legacy code. I'm your host, Robbie Russell. On this episode, Lorna Mitchell, a developer, speaker, open source advocate, maintainer, and technical writer. Lorna joins us from Yorkshire in the United Kingdom. Lorna Mitchell, we're so glad to have you join us on Maintainable. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me here.
So as you reflect on your experience in the industry, what do you believe are a few common characteristics of, dare I say, well-maintained software?
Every piece of software is different. I mean, we all think our software is a snowflake, but in some cases, they are all different. But the thing that they have in common, if it's well maintained, it makes it easy to get into. So I think a good tell for how well maintained something is whether it has documentation, maybe some automated tests, whether you can begin to use it. Now, this might be begin coming to the project for the first time, or it might just be begin, I slept since I last worked on this thing. Say hello to all my open source projects that I don't talk to all that often. And if it's well maintained, it makes it easier for you to pick up those threads and do the right thing and kind of succeed in the next thing that you need to change. This is super important for long-lived software, and this is typically how I judge a project I haven't seen before.
When you touch on things like documentation in particular, what would you say are some standout things that you're kind of usually expecting to find in documentation?
I always expect to find what the project is and what it does. My expectations are not met all that often. But if it's there, then I know that this project has, or at least had, a clear purpose. So that's a good start. I also like to see instructions for different groups of users. So if you're new, here's the setup for installing and using this tool. You can download the binaries over there, like whatever. If you're contributing, then here are the instructions for this. But I also like to see if you're maintaining, here's a reminder of that release process that maybe you don't do all that often. And every one of those groups might have different setup or troubleshooting or extra instructions. But I'm looking for that sense of, did you know who this was for when you wrote these words? Is
it a safe assumption that you're seeing this primarily through a lens of like an open source project, or do you feel like there's very similar expectations when you're looking at like a private company's internal application that they're building?
I see a lot of open source projects, and I do think they are more likely to be designed for other people. Whereas inside a company, especially if it's been small, there's that one same developer and maybe he or she has worked for that company for a long time, you guarantee there is no documentation. Whereas if in projects where people knew that it might be handed on or that it might have a long lifespan, or they just had really good developers who do this sort of thing themselves, then you will find some documentation. And that's the sign of something that it could have a long lifespan, in my opinion.
In those environments where they have like those just one or two people working on a project, and they don't produce a lot of documentation because they don't necessarily think they're going to need to reference it themselves. Or I hear people talking like, well, it just quickly gets outdated if you're not regularly updating. Like, where's that line you think that teams should be thinking about? Is it just like, whoa, when you're going to get a new job and then I'm better write some documentation for the next person? But like, what if, people always talk about the bus factor type of thing. Like, well, what happens if something unexpected happens? And we're kind of like, well, we have to continue handling building this thing or keeping it running. And so where's that kind of line for you? Or how do you think about like, if you were going to advise people, like, don't skimp out on that too quickly?
I think there's something there, and it's not really about the team size. Simon Willison did a lovely post about all of his one user project has some automated testing and some documentation. I'm sure that's not comprehensive documentation, but it's enough to get him started or restarted. And I think that's a great yardstick. And I kind of wish I had written that post myself, although read Simon's, it's really good.
What was that again? Let me get Simon
Willison. We can get it in the show notes.
Yeah, we'll do that. Okay.
I will find the link for you. It doesn't matter how big the team is. You always need something written down, and it doesn't need to be, bulletproof, every possible combination. But if you change the package manager, you need to go update your README instructions.
That seems reasonable. Something else I wanted to kind of dig into with you is, when it comes to improving software, because it can be, kind of a little bit of a long-term journey, especially when we're working on these legacy systems. So I want to dive into specific experiences that I've heard about. So like, can you recall a time when you were helping improve an older software system? And how do you like, when you're diving into that as someone that's maybe newer to the project, how do you think about diving into those projects?
This is a great question, and I want to tell you a story about a project that I now maintain. It's an open source project, so I'm not bringing any former employers or associates into disrepute. I maintain a project called RST to PDF. It's a Python library that takes restructured text and outputs a PDF format. When I began as a maintainer on this project, I had been a user for quite a while. The project was abandoned. So I took on that project with my co-maintainer, or rather he took on the project and roped me in, I think is the right way around. But we're not Python developers. It's a Python project. We're not Python developers. So I jumped into a new project and really a new tech stack. I had only used Python casually at that time.
Hey listeners, it's Robbie here. You know, it wasn't all that long ago. I'd find myself debugging a weird issue in one of our clients' Rails app. I log into one platform to track down the error, only to realize it was tied to some performance issue. And guess what? That meant hopping over into a completely different tool and trying to match things up based off of timestamps, if I was lucky. And let me tell you, my productivity didn't exactly thank me for that. Enter AppSignal, our podcast sponsor, and the tool that eliminates all that back and forth. They bring error tracking, performance monitoring, host metrics, custom metrics, uptime monitoring, and logging into one seamless platform. It's a single source of truth that helps keep your app running like a well-rehearsed symphony. Whether you're working with Ruby, Elixir, Node, Python, or tracking front-end errors in JavaScript, AppSignal has your back. They're always adding support for more languages and frameworks too. And here's the best part. AppSignal won't break the bank. Plans start at just $23 US a month. Plus, they're ISO 27001 certified and fully GDPR and HIPAA compliant, so your data is safe. Oh, and because you're a loyal Maintainable listener, you can use the promo code Maintainable at checkout for 10% off your first year. So head over to appsignal.com, tell them that your good friend Robbie from Maintainable sent you, and start making your app sing. What led you to think, hey, I'm going to start helping work on the project after it had been abandoned? Like, was it that, were there bugs that you were experiencing or something that was causing you friction? Or like, did you see a scenario where there's like, hey, people have open PRs or bugs and maybe I can go help squash those for someone else?
I had been an active user of RST to PDF for a number of years. I have some accessibility needs, which means I don't use a mouse or a pointing device at all. Everything has to be done from the keyboard. However, also given a lot of conference talks. And if you can just like imagine in your mind for a moment, creating a slide deck only using your keyboard. Right, it's a hard thing. Okay. So this RST to PDF tool, I write my content in restructured text. It produces slides. They kind of look like they were made from a very old Python script, but they work. They're very consistent. They separate the content and presentation. It's like docs as code, but it's slides as code. And so I had been using this tool and I'm really dependent on it, actually, because there are not many tools that really work well. I've seen some markdown ones, but they usually present in the browser. Something goes wrong in different scenarios. So I love this thing, PDF, fonts are embedded, images are embedded, back it up on your USB stick, put the USB stick on your body. You are good to go around the world and give talks. And I was doing that for a while. So I was very engaged with this project. And I have forgotten what the friction point was that made us realize that this thing was abandoned. And with all the love in the world to its previous maintainer who created this from scratch and maintained it for about 15 years.
Oh, wow. Yep.
And then decided maybe he was interested in other stuff now. Fair. He responded to us and gave us commit access. When we adopted that project, it had no working test suite, had tests, but they didn't really work, hadn't worked for years. The dependencies were outdated. I'm not certain, but it's possible that the problem was that version of the code didn't work with the next version of Python or something. This might have been a Python 2, Python 3 thing. Sure, it was around that sort of time, and we definitely did a Python 3 release. So yeah, I jumped into a tech stack I didn't know, moving between major versions of that programming language into a big project. It's not a massively well-known open source project in terms of it's not a household name, but it is quite widely used. It's in the dependencies stack for lots of projects because Sphinx uses it for one of its ways of doing PDF output. And it's also packaged by almost all the distros. So we have these like twice a year discussions with all the different packages for the different Linux distros. So yeah, I was scratching my own itch. And I also felt that this tool, I think this is true of a lot of utility projects. They're so important, but they're kind of not that glamorous. It would be impossible to replace, but at the same time, it's not that exciting to work on. And so, yeah, the first thing we did was make it work with new Python, upgrade the test suite, get everything working, and automate that. I mean, I think I say that's the first thing we did. It took at least a couple of years. It's been a big undertaking.
I can only imagine. Was that one of your first open source, like getting that deeply involved in an open source project, or have you been doing a lot of stuff in open source over the years prior to
I had done a lot in open source before that and been an open source maintainer. I thought I was done. I had like handed over my different projects to new homes and moved around into different tech stacks, different work. I was working as a developer advocate, so I was on the road a lot, which does not make you a good open source maintainer. And this thing showed up needing some love.
Yeah.
It's still in my foster care right now.
You know, what I'm curious about, you mentioned like joining an existing open source project and then also, you just mentioned that you'd worked on other projects and kind of maybe handed them off over time. For those listening, like as someone that also has I wouldn't say I'm like actively maintaining a project, but I'm fairly involved in a project and kind of dip my toes in it occasionally, but there's other people doing a lot more work on it. And there's people ask me like, oh, how do you keep doing this for so long? And I'm like, it's been a little over 15 years since I started that particular project, and new people that have been working on the project for the last few, like in recent years. And how do you decide maybe it's time to take a step back or hand over the keys? And like you mentioned that scenario where like the other person seemingly had abandoned it. And I think people might accuse me of times of having abandoned, but not really. I'm kind of just loosely around. Have you looked back on that? Would you like do it differently the next time than how you might have done it in the past? Or any advice for people out there like that might be thinking maybe it's time to hand over, just hand the keys over and be like, have fun with this. You got this.
Yeah, I think this is very dependent on the project that you're running and kind of how you came to it, whether it's yours to give. I'm a maintainer on a bunch of different things, and I have been maintainers on different things over time. I was collaborating on one of the web frameworks for a while just because I was working with it a lot and they asked me to help. And, that fizzled. And then I checked recently and saw that they'd kind of removed my access, which is great. I haven't been active there for a while. One of the earlier ones, which I did hand over to new owners, had a lot of contributors. It had a lively contribution cohort. And I really felt that as my attention was pulled in more different directions, I was holding them back by them feeling they had to ask my permission for things. I had already grown some pretty serious key players who also had maintained access, and I just made sure they had everything that they needed and my blessing.
I think that's useful for me to hear. And again, for those listening that know about my open source project, I'm not saying I'm going to be stepping away from that anytime soon, but it's just more of I'm not that involved these days, but I get a lot of attention because I was air quoting, the creator of the project. All right, but let's talk a bit about one of the things I was kind of really curious to talk about was about some of the work you've done with like OpenAPI and API governance. So for those that might not be familiar, what is OpenAPI?
OpenAPI is a machine-readable way to describe your APIs. So it's a standard. It's written in either JSON or YAML, and it essentially says, right, this is the API. This is what it is. This is what it's about. This is how it's licensed. And here are all of the endpoints that you can call. So at this URL, you can use maybe a get and a post, and they do these different things. And you send this data and you get these responses. So it's like a it can be quite long, as you can just imagine, of all of that data written in JSON or YAML that I just described. But it describes everything in your API, and it's there as an interoperability tool so that you can describe your API, other people can use it, and you can also integrate with other tools like docs or mock servers or SDK generators, API gateways, that sort of thing.
Interesting. I feel like, doing a little bit of research on you, it seems like APIs and open standards seems to be kind of a recurring theme in your work. How did that come about?
APIs and open standards is definitely a recurring theme, not really on purpose. So my origin story is I'm a web developer. PHP is my original, that's my home community.
What version of PHP did you start with?
I've done a little bit of PHP 4 commercially, but I had done a lot as a hobby. But by the time I was working in it full time, more like PHP 5. But I've been away a little while from that community. But that's my origin community. I basically was doing a lot of web development, a lot of integrations. I've always been back-end specialist. And I already mentioned the thing about not using a pointing device. You can't do front-end dev. You can't do the browser side, the client side, if you can't interact with the developer tools. And they are all very GUI. Whereas a lot of the editors, the PHP side, the server side, the databases, those all have keyboard accessible tooling, terminal tooling, or stuff with good shortcuts. So yeah, I'm an API developer, kind of not through choice, but I love it. I like to think I would have chosen it anyway. So I have just done a lot of APIs and it is so frustrating to me. It feels so inefficient that we constantly reinvent all these different standards, different ways, all we need is another standard. So you're right, I have been in this space a long time. I have been trying to explain HTTP and REST to developers for a long time. And that led me very naturally into working with APIs, working for API providers, working on API integrations, and eventually becoming first a contributor to the OpenAPI standard and then a maintainer of that standard over time.
I'll include some links for folks in the show notes. One of the things that I came across one of your blog posts about creating short tech writing style guide, creating like a short tech writing style guide for developers. And what kind of really stood out for me was because traditional style guides can feel a bit overwhelming, especially for those who don't write documentation regularly. So I was curious about maybe digging in this a little bit. So you mentioned that the traditional style guides can sometimes be too long or complex for casual contributors. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about kind of what's your kind of thesis here, and I'll include links to the couple of these articles as well in the show notes for people.
Right. Yeah, we have this big divide in software between the people who write code and the people who write words. And the people who write code think words is something that other people do, and the people who and those same people sometimes think the people who write the words shouldn't be writing the code. And it can all get a little bit siloed, and I find that very frustrating. However, having worked in developer relations quite a bit the last few years, and then developer experience, which is also really docs heavy, open source really docs heavy because you're onboarding people all the time, right?
Right.
I've owned a couple of docs platforms, and trying to make it so that you have some level of consistency, but the style guide is not a book, right?
Yeah.
Because that is gatekeeping. That is closing out contributors if you are requiring an extremely high level of fussiness. Especially, I have mostly worked for international companies as well. So I'm working with almost no native English speakers. If they're technical, they're probably not trained to write wonderful English. And honestly, we don't need them to. Everybody calm down. You don't need to know what a gerund is. I just need you to, imagine you're commanding something to do this thing. That's your title. Just keep it super short, give an example, move on. And I was giving this talk about engineering, documentation platforms, and enabling contributors and communities. And I went on stage somewhere and I said, I have a style guide so short that even an engineer reads it. And the audience fell on the floor laughing. And I was like, I need to write that down. And about 3 companies later, I was writing yet another short style guide. And I told them, hey, I'm going to blog this at the weekend, and then you can use it inside your company. And that, they made some changes. And every organization is different. There is a style guide. If you can do these 10 things, then your stuff is probably almost ready to publish. And the writers can just edit, review, fix any major English mistakes, and we can all live happily ever after.
Yeah. We'll be back with our interview Lorna in just a moment. Hi, it's me, Robbie. I want to take a quick moment to say thank you for making time to listen to the podcast. If you're finding these conversations valuable, please consider sharing a link amongst your peers and a writing review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube to help spread the word. Also, do you know someone in our industry who you think I should have on the podcast? Shoot me an email to robbie@maintainable.fm. And now, let's get back to our interview, Lorna Mitchell. Do you get into things like rating tools that might give you like an idea of like what's the reading level comprehension for something? Is that something you pay attention to very much, or is it just like, do you lean on tools like that as well to think about that? Or do you, because I've always been trying to be like, oh, how can I make this simpler for people to understand it? And also just like someone that's a passerby, be like, you don't need to understand everything just to kind of get a sense of like what this thing does, kind of maybe back to the original documentation point on open source projects in particular. And like, how do you explain what something is and why it might be useful, let alone like how to develop on it? And those are like different audiences in a way. And so it's not like marketing, but it's this interesting part about, and also like imagine like being in a developer experience role. It's kind of like this interesting line between your technical resource for people that are interacting with the organization or the software projects that your people are trying to integrate with or use the tools that you're making available. But there's also just like, what exactly does this thing do? And there's a little bit of maybe a Venn diagram there. And so how do you kind of think about that? Or do you think there's certain types of people that are maybe better fit to occupy that role? They can kind of think from both of those perspectives, not just purely from a technical, maybe air quoting, stereotypical developer mindset.
Yeah, this is really tricky. And I think finding people who have the combination of the technical expertise, the communication skills, that's sort of the strength to create the words, and also the big picture knowledge to understand how this can be more concise without being terse. So giving just enough information, but not too much, enough examples, but not too many, maybe some background, but not a whole history lesson. So those things are so difficult I find them very difficult to teach. And someone told me once that the things that you can't teach are because you never learned them, like they're instinctive. So finding someone with that kind of magic, big picture comms space, as well as the writing skills and the technical chops, is pretty rare. They all work in developer experience or developer relations, honestly. Or they're the engineer who keeps doing other things. This is my origin story also. But in terms of documentation quality, things that you can do that anyone can do, I don't usually worry about the writing age, because the sentence complexity, can be a problem, but some of these tools are complex. So don't get hung up on that. A bigger problem is the history lesson, the extra context, the 8 choices of how to do a thing. Like, just pick one, link some others. That's the most, it has to be linear as much as possible. I don't care if there is another way to do it, or we used to do it that way. Like, what's your recommended way? Just write that down and move that forward. So there's like trying to get to the heart of the matter. And for more complex setup, like I've written a lot of tutorials, the hardest piece, I think, is getting the steps in the minimum number of context switches order. So don't create an empty database and then start your code and then download some data and then import it into the database and then go to your code and then add the database. Like just start here and then, now you need a thing. Let's connect to that. Try and put the steps in a different order. The tools having said that, I don't use the reading age tools. The tools that I do use, I actually use a lot of prose formatting. So like syntax checking on restructured text or markdown or whatever. The joy of writing mostly in restructured text is that it's a Python community origin and all Python people are very good at white space. So you get more a beautiful source anyway. I also like to use tools that can spot those mistakes that we make all the time. So I'm going to shout out to Veil, which is a prose linter, and it can do things like, did you already define this acronym in this article? Is this product name correct? I used to work for a company that had, amongst a large number of other things, Kafka as a service. You cannot refer to Kafka as Kafka. It must be Apache Kafka brackets TM at all times. So misspellings of Kafka with no Apache, lowercase Kafka, all of that, you've got to catch it and either fix it or usually we had it integrated with our CI system. So it would just give some annotations in your pull request to be like, maybe you mean this word or that word. So just making sure that we're always nailing the product names, we're always nailing the proper nouns, we're catching those very common mistakes. And I have been working in the previous project, I turned on the stop using future tense rule because it's incredibly common. When you run this command, this will happen. Like this happens. We don't need to get into how much in the future it is or whether it's complete or not. Just stop using future tense. Apparently I now see it everywhere, but Vale can check that as well. There's a rule for it. So that's a really nice way to keep the voice consistent when you have a lot of contributors.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring up the future tense, because I feel like one of the things that Grammarly likes to point out to me is that I tend to use past tense quite a bit. And so it tries to get me to at least get out of that habit. But I'm like, I must not be talking a lot about the future. Maybe that just speaks to my typical demeanor that I have no hope for myself in the future. So I'm just today now. I can't think anyways, and this is how I used to do it. All right, I'm going a little bit off tangent there. You're thinking about kind of like hearing like even just the fact that, there's it didn't even occur to me, there's tools out there that are helping you make sure that you're just correctly naming things like Apache, Kafka, trademark. That sounds like big company type, larger organization type concerns. And I would imagine your typical blogger is probably not thinking about that, but they're probably also not getting like a letter in the mail from Apache being like, hey, just by the way, you need to do this. It hadn't even occurred to me to think about that intentional, but I don't know what I'm. So I'll include links to some of those linters and stuff like that. I also know you talk about keeping things concise and still being clear and helpful. What strategy do you find for like if someone producing some writing and some documentation and then they share it and now you're the person that's going to be reviewing that? Do you have any thoughts or advice? It's kind of, to me, if it's like a PR, like a pull request process, right? And so it's just like, do you feel like there's a lot of good conventions around, I guess, because how is that different than like editing, I suppose? But, there's linting tools that I guess will catch some of that stuff in a similar way that we try to do that with our code so that we're not spending too much time on like, hey, you're not using the syntax quite properly, like to our style guide. So you can do that on a documentation level as well. Are there any other things that you think that linters just aren't going to account for that would be good for people that are reviewing someone else's documentation, that they're like, I don't know how best to give them feedback because writing maybe feels a little bit more personal in a way because it's like that's their voice and like you're saying it wrong. How do you think about that?
There's a lot of variables in this, and it's a little bit what are you writing, and also who's the author. So if you're writing a blog post, technical blog post or whatever, you can use your own voice. I don't need to get in on that. If you're contributing to our existing docs project, it needs to have some sort of similarity, like it's met some of the other articles that are already in the docs project. And, I'm not formally trained as a writer or a documentarian, so I'm probably more relaxed about this than a lot of documentation platform owners are. I am all for inclusion. I like to hear everybody's, if you have something you think our customers need to read, then I'm going to get it into the product docs and we're just going to make it happen. For most authors, it's a literal pull request, docs as code, you put your markdown in. I will, on the first pass, often comment and ask for things to be reordered. We've talked about that big picture thing. That's a very important thing for reviewers to hold in mind. Just exactly like writing a function. What is this function? What's it for? What does it do? How should it be used? Does it take one value or an array of values or what? Does it return something sensible? The same thing really for documentation. And I probably review equal quantities of code and words. I see it as a very transferable skill, and I teach it in very similar ways to teams on both sides of that coding divide. For an author who is actively looking to improve their writing skills, and I will always know who that is in any organization, then I will put a lot of edits and feedback or whatever for something where the author doesn't care. We're made to write this thing, or we're in a massive hurry, or there are other constraints. I'll just push one more commit to the pull request, ask them to review the diff, and we'll push it. So how much happens there just is whether someone is open to learn, whether that's appropriate for this content type in this moment. And if not, well, that's fine. I just edit and they can go and look back at the edits. I've greatly enjoyed working with actual writers, which I am not. Here in the UK, we don't teach grammar in school, and you can stop writing words at the age of 16 when you specialize in your science and maths subjects, which is exactly what I did. So I've never really been taught to write at all. Working with people, especially those people who have learned English in a formal way and do it as professional English people, is a joy, because I can read someone's article and say, here's a sentence. I would like it to say this now. Why? And I will learn something about the way that we name the grammar in English so that I can give that feedback to someone who wrote it, who probably also learned English formally, whereas I'm just well read, which is nice. But again, I didn't learn it and I can't teach it.
Interesting. You mentioned working with someone and like knowing if they're going to be receptive or wanting to learn or improve their writing skills. I don't know that everybody knows where everybody is on that, I think, when in these situations. So is that something that you find that your roles that you've been in, that it's kind of like, well, you'll spend time trying to get that information from people, like have conversations like, hey, how do you think about your writing? And like having that conversation, and that role maybe being a place for that. But like if it's a team where they don't have maybe someone coming in that spends more of their time, writing for developer technical customers or what have you, to read API documentation or what have you, the project documentation. What advice for you have for people that are kind of in that space where they're like, we don't have really like someone that's more experienced here to give us this feedback, but like I would like to get better at my writing, but how do I ask my peers to be a little bit more to give me that sort of feedback, or like or vice versa, like, or if you're someone like that's reviewing someone else's writing and you're like, well, I don't want to like make them feel bad because I'm like gonna tear this document up or whatever, and like there's a bunch of issues here, but how do you think about like thinking about those people and those both in that situation?
I think about it the same way I think about reviewing code pull requests as well. So I think you need to look at, first of all, if you're opening the pull request, you need to say what kind of feedback you like or you're looking for if you want good feedback. That's true for everything, every type of feedback ever. Your feedback gets exponentially better every time you add a note about what kind of feedback you wanted. So when I invite people to see talk rehearsals, I'm not looking for feedback on my slides. They're terrible. I can't do better. I can't point. It's fine. So please don't talk to me about my slides. I'm looking for feedback on the structure or the way that the words that I choose or something. So I think that there's a little bit of this on the author of the pull request as well. As a reviewer of code or of words, what I teach people is you can pick 3 things. Pick 3 things. Beyond that, if you have more than 3 things, you're just nitpicking. Unless they are showstoppers, in which case, absolutely. But if you're reviewing, could you edit? Because the second pair of eyes for fixing spellings, moving commas, changing there, and there to there and there, like just do it, because that you're seeing it as the second pair of eyes, and that's an important thing that a reviewer does. There's also a structure review. Is there enough intro or too much? Too much is way more common than not enough. It's just in our nature. I think we've all read too many long textbooks and think that's how writing should work. And then, just give enough feedback to make it a little bit better. And cool, move on.
How do you assess, you push out some documentation, and maybe I can answer this myself, I suppose, just thinking how this might actually work. Because if you worked on some documentation for an API, and then internally you might have a certain perspective on how successful that is, but what about actually getting real world feedback from that? And is it just like based off of the type of questions that end up coming to you naturally? Or because I would imagine if you have some API documentation and people don't ask questions because they don't understand it, then you might not ever hear some feedback because people just kind of, well, this might not be for me, but it just becomes like, maybe the documentation didn't communicate something and we missed that opportunity to have that conversation. So how do you kind of solicit feedback from the end users type of scenario?
Yeah, I mean, if you're publishing an API with some documentation, maybe you have some paying customers. And I certainly have had that experience where there's been people that can be like, oh, hey, we built that feature you wanted. Let me know what you think. Because if they can't do it with the docs, we know we've got a problem. So some sort of early user interview or customer zero stuff can be brilliant. And sometimes, like when I worked in developer relations, this is something that we picked up in DevRel all the time. We ship a new API feature. We write the first docs and examples and we go back and say, but this doesn't work. This doesn't do what I expected. This doesn't look like any of our other endpoints. So sometimes you can get internal feedback. Most modern docs platforms as well will have that embedded feedback widget of some kind, so that should be coming through to whoever wrote the docs. So I just keep an eye on that as well, because that can sometimes, people can tell you that the docs are wrong and they're not wrong, but just the fact that you're getting noise from that endpoint can really indicate that somebody needs to go and do something with it.
Hey folks, it's Robbie here. I want to take a moment to tell you about my company, Planet Argon. Think of us as a traveling circus for your software projects, rolling into town to bring excitement, balance, and awe-inspiring performances to your legacy applications. Need a few extra performers? We offer staff augmentation, like adding expert jugglers to keep everything running smoothly. Looking for a daring new act? Our fractional development services are perfect for taking your software from a balancing act to the main event. We specialize in technologies like Ruby on Rails, React, and Laravel, just to name a few. So if you know of a company whose wheels feel like a clown car, overstuffed with technical debt, or struggling to deliver a big finale, send them our way. We'll help them dazzle their audience with a show-stopping performance. Visit us at planetargon.com. Again, that's planetargon.com. Dun, 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 dun. All right, let's get back to the show. And remember, every great circus needs a strong ringmaster. I think that's helpful. I want to kind of jump back over to APIs just for a moment as well, because there was definitely a topic I wanted to dig into with you. So one of your other blog posts was about API linting and the 4 levels of readiness for API quality. So in your post, you outlined 4 levels, from having an API description to achieving full consistency, fully consistent interface. Could you walk us through those levels and explain how teams can use this framework to evaluate where they are with their API?
Yeah, so the way I think about the linting levels is, I've worked a lot in API standards and API governance, previously working for Redocly, who have a really great tool for this. People say, what governance rules should I use? And the answer is always, it depends, which is, of course, not that useful. But over time, from helping lots of different teams, I want people to think about where they are and where they're going to, which is when I put together this levels thing, right? If you have absolutely no quality checks at all on your OpenAPI description, right, you should start by validating it. And that sounds super basic, but depending how your OpenAPI description comes to being, so quite a lot of them are handwritten, others might be generated from code, and there's no guarantee that's valid either. So is it even valid? This is a great start, because if it is, then you can start to use it with more tools. So do this first, right? And if you go from no checks to automated checks every time we make a change, we check it's valid, that's a big step forward, right? I am proud of you. So that's level 1, having a valid description. Well, it's level 0, having a valid description. Level 1, having basic standards. And this might be things like, does it even have a license? Does it have some contact information? Are you naming things the same way everywhere? Is there security defined for each endpoint? Let's kind of get some basics in here so that somebody can sensibly integrate with it. And I feel like every API, no matter how inconsistent or organically designed, is how I like to talk about those things that we shipped once and it's grown out of control. I think we can get to this level with all APIs. So I think the level 1 is just trying to make it so that people can actually use it. Consistent interface is more about your API design. So is it always camel case, always snake case? Are the parameter segments in the same order every time? Does everything have a description? Are you using pagination? Do you use different pagination approaches on different collections? Let's try and make that more consistent. And the reason that matters is because someone who is integrating with your API builds that familiarity, right? So they start to feel at home and they can do more things without having to look it up all the time. The third level is it's a joy to use. It's got examples and great illustrations and maybe really rich descriptions with markdown and things in. This is a big stretch for an organization that has a very basic API and hasn't really done a lot with it. But if you can get there, every level brings value, and that's why I kind of put those levels out there, and you can find what fits your customer needs. Not every API needs to be a joy to use, right? So what's the right thing for you, air quotes, might be different for different organizations or different APIs within an organization. Is this your flagship product, or is it how people sign up for the newsletter? You might have different levels of standards applied.
No, I appreciate that. And one of the things I thought was a good thing to point out was even getting into using better examples than what a developer might historically have done a couple of decades ago, use foo or bar and be let's use some better examples that people can kind of connect with on a different emotional level. I think even your example was using holiday planning and just I think that can be useful when you're looking at the example data in particular. Like we can do a little bit more than just having some gibberish or lorem ipsum or something in a description field or something. So
yeah, and the more that I spend time creating these resources for technical audiences, the more I've realized people just want to copy and paste, right? So they're not actually going to read the rule. They're only going to read the words if they've got into trouble.
Right.
If there's code with a copy button, they're going to copy it. So if it has placeholder example values, it makes it really obvious which one is the category, which one is the product identifier, which one is the description, and which one is the quantity. Like then if the placeholders are there with the example values, they are more likely to be successful without even noticing that you did that work for them.
I like that. I'll definitely include links to both of those articles in the show notes for people and to your blog so they can read some more of this and see some of your talks as well. A couple of quick last questions for you. Is there a non-software, non-technical book that you find yourself recommending to peers?
This might be a little bit content nerdy because I read, write, speak, like I think about content a lot. And I have been recently rereading the How to Take Smart Notes. It's basically based on the Zettelkasten approach of active reading and then processing your notes into like little traditionally index cards. Mine is clearly a markdown file in Obsidian because I would lose an index. Yes, waving index cards. I mean, yeah, which doesn't work that well on a podcast, but was awesome. How to take smart notes. I read a lot and this brain's pretty full now. Like I don't remember things. It's hard to look stuff up. I said earlier about, in terms of education, I went straight to maths and science, age 16. No one really taught me to critically read and take notes. Like that is not a thing we do in engineering. I keep a great lab book, but I don't really read critique and bring ideas together, which as a writer now with the blog, and I would never say never to another book, I need those skills. So yeah, I've been rereading How to Take Smart Notes and kind of filling in some of the things that I didn't get from reading it before.
I'm going to look that book up and I'll include links to that in the show notes as well. But that sounds very timely for me because I do take a lot of weird notes and I don't know what my structure or organization process. It's just looks like gibberish on back of index cards when I'm doing these calls, and then I use a different notebook when I'm on a sales call. I don't understand how I make sense of it all later, but I could probably boost that skill set myself. So I'll include links to that in the show notes for everybody. Thanks for the recommendation. And where can listeners best follow your thoughts and ruminations online? Your blog, anywhere else?
Yeah, I think my blog, my website is a great place to find me, lornajane.net. You can find all of my other things, so my GitHub, my socials and everything there. I'm blogging there. I try and link the podcasts, articles, talks, videos, whatever, also on that site. So it's quite a good place to kind of keep up with what I'm thinking about. And the other projects that I'm active in, I guess I'm mostly posting on LinkedIn, and I'm active with the OpenAPI standard that we talked about, Open UK, which is an open technology organization based here in the UK. I'm on their board. So those kinds of places is a great place to keep up with me.
Wonderful. Well, it's been such a delight having you join us on Maintainable, Lorna. Thank you so much for stopping by to talk shop with us.
It's my pleasure.
Maintainable.